Ironically, for a movie with such a mental premise, watching them back today it strikes me how grounded in physics the original two Terminator movies are. There's a crunching, hulking weight to every blow and shotgun blast that's almost palpable. It's punchy and it's incredibly satisfying to watch. It's one of the best things about the original two movies actually, in my opinion. James Cameron, I believe, was fully aware of the hyperbolic nature of his Terminator character, and yet he took his movies deadly seriously. He lays out the ground rules of the film world very early on, and he sticks to them. So even if the basic premise is a bit mad, we always believe in this world. It's all pretty internally consistent, and it fucking rocks also, of course. James Cameron posited the question, if this ludicrous thing actually existed in our world, how would it move? What would it weigh? What would its physical capabilities be? What would it require to actually take down one of these things? If a giant 6-foot metal man leapt from a speeding flipped-over truck and barreled forward like a fucking massive meat-covered bowling ball, what would it do to a steel handrail when it ploughed straight into it? These are the important questions, and James Cameron answered them as best he could. So yeah, the premise is kind of fantastical, even a little bit silly, but somehow we always feel grounded in reality when we watch these movies. Could anyone other than James Cameron at that point in time have pulled this feat off? I don't know. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that there aren't little cracks here and there in the films, but they always remain in the realm of debate, in my opinion. For example, could the homemade nitroglycerin pipe bomb that Reese made actually blow apart a Terminator's endoskeleton? Some people say yes, some people say no, but we could at least sit down and discuss it. It's within the realms of possibility, and that's as far as it needs to go. I really don't consider myself a big nitpicker when it comes to this kind of stuff, but when it's one of the strongest aspects of two of my all-time favourite films, I just can't help but take issue with some of the action scenes in Terminator Zero, particularly in the first few episodes. I got no qualms at all with our hero being a woman. I've got no qualms with her being physically tough, within reason, and capable. Of course I don't, I'm a James Cameron fan after all. But having a physical object that has to weigh like 400 pounds hanging off your leg while you're suspended by a rope tied to your waist without suffering any apparent physical damage is in Wile E. Coyote territory. If the Terminator didn't dislocate her legs or rip them off completely, then at the very least the Terminator would have crushed her ankle, surely. I mean, I suppose if he'd done that then he would have probably fallen down the big hole there, but if he didn't kill her then, surely he'd take his chances? I don't know.
God, a person could go crazy thinking about this.
A little later on, she gives it a flying kick to the face, presumably in a pair of lead moon boots or something, because she then proceeds to dance around the Terminator, apparently unhindered. Is the Terminator made of plastic or something? Surely she would have obliterated her metatarsals quicker than David Beckham in the run-up to a major international football tournament. That was a very old and culturally specific joke, and it was shit as well, so I apologise. She then gets pounded on the back by the Terminator. Even a silverback gorilla would surely smash you to bits like a bag of crisps if it did this to you, so how on earth does she not get her spine blown to smithereens in this scene? It's a giant metal killing machine. I mean, the first thing the Terminator does in his screen debut, well, the first thing he does is go for a moonlit walk in the park with his dong flapping around, but immediately after that, he turned Brian Thompson into a shish kebab with his bare fist. So how on earth is stuff like this happening? It's beyond me, I'm sorry. Before we get too far into this, yeah, I have watched the whole thing, and I know that this Terminator was reprogrammed by the little kid there, and it couldn't kill Aiko, his grandmother, because he would have ceased to exist himself, and yada yada yada, but surely Aiko herself would know what these things are capable of. She wouldn't even attempt to do the stuff that she does, like flying kicking him in the face, for example. While the Terminator is whacking her on the back, surely she must be thinking to herself, wow, this Terminator's not had his Weetabix this morning, has he? Why isn't my spine being obliterated? Maybe he thinks I've got a Malteser trapped in my windpipe and he's trying to get it out for me. The cherry on top is when the Terminator's leg goes from the chemical whatsits she's thrown on it. That aspect is fair enough, and I like the sarin gas attack reference and all that, but she then pushes the thing backwards and down into a lift shaft. Is it on fucking casters or something? I can't square this one, I'm sorry. If you had another character in the group who was like a world's strongest man type, barrel-chested, bald-headed geezer called Magnus or whatever, if you had someone like that and he saw his opportunity, gritted his teeth and sprinted right into it, given that the Terminator's leg was knackered, then I could buy that, But a slender little Japanese lady? The idea of Kusanagi from Ghost in the Shell versus the Terminator is a really cool idea, and that's kind of what this is, but the Major is cybernetically enhanced to within an inch of her humanity, so that would make sense, but apparently this is a normal human woman. I kept waiting for the reveal. Maybe it'll happen in a future season or something, but as far as we know now, she's just a human. I'm sorry, I need it explaining to me.
I don't get it. I don't get it. I don't get it.
Terminator in Terminator 0 has a slightly different vibe to the T-800 from the movies. It's just different, and that's okay in my book, up to a point. Let's hear a bit about the Terminator from these two geezers.
Obviously, in order to get the intensity on the face to make you a killer, there's a fine line with having you be completely blank. So, there was some sense of emotion isn't really the right word, but intention, I think. The fact that you were a killer, I don't want to say predator, but a predatory creature in a way, and very focused on your goal.
Narrowed it down to just if this would be a robot, what movement would there be going on? And it would literally only be the arm coming across, pulling out, cocking, shooting. No shoulder movement, no head movement. Goes back, and then the whole body would turn and walk away.
But with a smoothness too.
Oh yeah,
it was like very positive and very smooth. Not jerky either, because jerkiness wastes energy. It was like the ultimate efficiency. To get the shortest path between 2 points.
So, there you go, they've obviously put some thought into this, eh? So is the Terminator in Zero a match for the way he's described by these two guys? At times he is, I would say. I mean, in the cop shop scene, for example, which is very reminiscent of the original movie, only with a T-1000 outfit on. But at other times he's kind of more ghoulish than Terminator-ish. He kind of shuffles and jerks, and his movements are a bit staccato and unpredictable. I know it's anime, obviously, and smooth movement is very, very hard to achieve, but I still think they've consciously altered things a little bit in this department. Whether you like that or not is a matter of preference, of course, but I do feel that it differs somewhat from the original movies. The one in Zero is kind of frightening, and I like that, In fact, it has an almost demon or zombie-like vibe to it, with its awkward gait and kind of shuffling ambulation, and his freaky face, of course. Thinking about it, the character he most reminds me of, I think, is the character Me-Mania from Perfect Blue. Fantastic film. If you haven't seen it, you really should give it a watch. I've picked out a couple of stills here that might illustrate what I mean. You may disagree, of course. I mean, that's okay, I guess, sure. But I mean, is this a T-800? It must be some kind of different model, surely. That's the only way I can square any of this stuff, really. Maybe it's just a slightly different reality. As I said, with Cameron's films, he laid down the ground rules quickly, and he always stuck to them pretty much. Unfortunately, Terminator 0 is also somewhat inconsistent with itself. Terminator 0 is violent, it's very nasty at times, in fact, and I like that very much. I like that these Terminators are doing real, grisly damage. Terminator, at least the first one, used to scare me as a kid. It's more of a horror film, and I think that's the way it should be. So I like this, But does this Terminator carry a real sense of threat as such? Not so much, funnily enough. Not like the T-800 in the original movie did. Not to me, anyway. That's because its effectiveness is rather inconsistent. It seems to vary depending on the needs of the plot. In that sense, it doesn't really play cricket in the way the originals did, and my suspension of disbelief was broken a few times. Annoyingly, because I liked lots of aspects of the show. I like the subtext about the Japanese era of robotics, the end of the bubble economy, and the references to the sarin gas attacks of 1995. This is good stuff, the kind of stuff that belongs in Terminator content, in my opinion. But personally, I wish the writers on these things wouldn't focus quite so much on the time travel aspect. To me, the time travel was always of mostly instrumental value to the original films. It was the weakest element, I would say, and it was already pretty flawed. I mean, for a start, backwards time travel is probably impossible. The past can't be changed in that manner because that's not how time works, all that kind of stuff, fine. But the original films told us that this stuff was possible, and we had to accept that. And if it were possible, then had the Terminator travelled through time first, then he would have just killed Sarah Connor unopposed in 1984, and the machines humans would have taken over anyway, probably. The humans couldn't just send a human back a bit later on because the Terminator would have already killed her 45 years ago or whatever. You know, at just a fundamental kind of level, it really doesn't bear much inspection. But that's okay, because it really didn't need to. It was just there largely to facilitate the real meat and potatoes of the story, and the action, more importantly. James Cameron has said that the central image of the Terminator, the original film that is, the image of the chrome skeleton walking out of the fire. Well, I'll let him explain.
It wasn't so much a theme as a kind of seminal image. I was in Rome. I was broke. I had a high fever, and I was just having these weird dreams. And I had this image of this kind of chrome skeleton, you know, death image coming out of a fire, kind of phoenix-like. And I just got up and sketched it, and then around the nucleus of that, I started to create a story and sort of backfill. Okay, what is it? Where did it come from? You know, who's it after? And it all sort of fell into place fairly quickly.
So yeah, this is the central image of the film, the real spark of inspiration, a spark of genius, some might say. The time travel stuff and yada 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 was sketched out after that to sort of justify how a metal man might find himself in the present day. It would enable him to do some really cool rear projection future war special effects stuff, and also showing the world in absolute ruin is part of this sort of middle finger to the banality and complacency of the modern world that runs right through the first two movies, in my opinion. The Terminator paints a picture of an America, well, a world sleepwalking into catastrophe. We see how wobbly its institutions are. The police are next to useless, and then there's the mental health services in the second film, and yeah, our main characters are out of step with this world, alienated, on the run. There's almost a palpable sense of frustration with the facade of modern life that underpins everything on screen in those first two films. The Terminator appears on screen and he just waltzes through the paper-thin facade, and we almost feel a faint sense of satisfaction when he does this, or I do, anyway. The film is a kick up the ass, a slap around the face. It's a wake-up call, and it works really well. But yeah, the time travel stuff in isolation is of mostly instrumental value to all this. The nub of the whole thing is that horrifying image, the metal, dehumanized figure. An image so powerful and uncanny and profoundly threatening that it lodges itself in your brain and it stays there.
It's not really about machines from the future. It's sort of about our relationship with technology, but it's really kind of about how our human potential for dehumanization ourselves. You see cops as examples, and then you know the other idea that not to trust technology and even not to trust the fabric of reality, because by the second film you've got this woman who's gone crazy, knowing that the world is a completely fragile place and it's all an illusion. It can all be torn away by this nuclear war. And I was sort of playing with that in the first film as well. That there's this war, it hasn't happened yet, but if you know that, everything changes and all your priorities change. You know, ideas like that. And I think that comes from being a kid in the 60s. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, clearly having these kind of fallout shelter, how to make a fallout shelter in your house, like that would do any good.
And I think Terminator stuff has to revolve around these two core aspects, and it has to avoid getting caught up too much in timelines and paradoxes and yada yada yada, because it just doesn't really hold up all that much. It wasn't designed that way.
I didn't build the fucking thing!
It's like trying to mount a CRT TV on a stud wall. It's just gonna drop to the floor and fuck up your house. Terminator 2 just about gets away with all this stuff if you don't think about it too hard, but in my opinion all of the follow-up material does get tangled up in this, unfortunately. With the original two movies we had to enjoy the action, the tension, the horror, and not think too carefully about all the time travel stuff. Just accept it, take it on its own terms, and it worked fine. In Terminator 0 we have to think really hard about the time travel stuff and not think too much about the action, because it doesn't make all that much sense. Alright then, dickhead, what would you make a new Terminator series about? Well, I think they should probably just leave the whole thing alone really now, to be honest. But, well, what about after the war? The future war, that is. What about after Skynet's defense grid was smashed and all that? What about a film or a series exploring the ruins of the human world? People rediscovering their history, their lost civilizations, coming to terms with the disaster, figuring out where it all went wrong. If it was a Japanese-produced anime again, you could work in some Japanese themes along the lines of the survivors of the nuclear blasts in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, or, just the survivors of modern warfare more generally. There would have to be some Terminators still floating around in the debris, of course. Perhaps people might be tempted to repair and reprogram these things to serve their own goals again, and a war with the machines could rear its head once more. You could discuss the cyclical nature of things. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, all that kind of business. I don't know, that's a pretty rich vein, it seems to me, and it also means that the writers wouldn't have to bend and prance about like gymnasts trying to avoid contradicting all the other movies. But look, this all sounds really negative, but don't get me wrong, I quite enjoyed this show overall, and I admire how it takes the Terminator premise and really makes it its own. It makes it its own a little bit too much for me is the only thing. It's all a bit too convoluted and nebulous for my tastes, well, for my Terminator tastes anyway. I miss some of the simplicity, the heroics, the pomp and swagger, coupled with that concrete hard edge that the first two movies had. I would have liked this series quite a bit more if it didn't have Terminator on the box, weirdly enough. But hey, it's well worth a watch. A lot of it is really good. Just pretend that the Terminators are not quite the ones from the Terminator films, and you'll be fine. What did you make of Terminator Zero? Please let me know in the comments below, and please remember...
What the hell?